Hi, could you briefly introduce yourself to the Erasmus students? Just a bit of background information about where you grew up.
I am a mom to one of your students. His name is Kenneth. He's an Erasmus student. I grew up in Nigeria. When I grew up there in the 80s. You know, we were very free. It's a bit different from the way people grew up, are here in Ireland. As a child, we spent all our hours of the day outside, which is quite different from what you have now. Okay. I grew up in a middle income family, mother, father, and my siblings, and it was very peaceful. We grew up in an area of Nigeria where we had vast vegetation, a lot of trees, a lot of greenery around us, and also a lot of animals as well. We had snakes and monkeys and baboons and lizards, butterflies everywhere. It was quite memorable, I have to say.
Alright, on to the next question. What was different from growing up as a girl or as a boy in Nigeria in the 80s?
Well, as a girl, you are expected to spend uh, some time apart from when you are playing. You're expected to be in the kitchen. In the 80s. So when my mom was cooking in the kitchen, I had to be there. Whether I was doing anything in the kitchen for her or not, you had to be learning how to cook because it was perceived that you were being groomed to become a wife. That was the way it was seen at that time. I don't know if things have changed now, but that was how it was then. That you were in the kitchen when your mom was cooking, and then you had some time to play. So that was what was different, growing up as a girl compared to my brother. And another thing to note was it wasn't very fashionable then for girls to put on trousers. So we couldn't wear jeans or trousers, especially when you had to go to the local markets. You had to have a dress or a skirt on, you know. It's changed now, but that is something different that happened during my time. And also, when it was a very big thing to go to places of worship, as a girl, you had to cover your hair with a scarf or a veil. You had to cover it when you were in the church because you couldn't be seen as a woman exposing your hair. There are many other things I can talk about, but these are the ones I can remember for now.
Alright, did you have any specific responsibilities growing up as a girl since you were the oldest child?
Well, as a girl, the only thing I think I can remember is that you were expected to be of good behavior. Um, you were always told by your parents, by my parents, that you have to be of good behavior because you have your junior ones, your younger siblings looking up to you. So, if say I was playing or not doing my homework or, just being rude, I was always corrected and, um, you know, told by my parents that, you have to be of good behavior because your younger siblings look up to you. And sometimes when my parents maybe were out of the house for something or the other. We always had people around, but it was expected that maybe as we were outside playing, I was to keep an eye on my younger siblings as well, and make sure they were also behaving themselves and not getting into any harm. And well, as a girl, what would have been different for boys, you just had more responsibility because they felt you as a girl were more, would I call it responsible, during that time in the 80s. And they just felt that you could, you were being groomed to become a wife and to be able to manage a home. So those kind of responsibilities started quite early. They would expect that maybe once it's time for dinner, that you laid the table, that you called your younger siblings to come to table to have their dinner, and also you helped to clear the dishes and washed the dishes. And as I said before, you helped in the kitchen to cook, and you helped as well during the weekends to clean the house, and also to do the laundry as well. So there were those kind of responsibilities, yeah, when I was younger, as the eldest child and being a girl.
Okay. Now, the girls have freedom to choose who they wanted to marry and their professions.
Um, it depended on where you were staying. So if you were from the urban areas, um, to some extent, you have freedom. If you had some freedom to choose who you wanted to get married to. But in the rural areas, then a lot of relation, I wouldn't call it relationship, but a marriage was done really between arranged between families. So most times the girl might not really know the man she was going to marry properly, but it would be like families, getting together and arranging, in a way, a marriage for their daughter. But I grew up in a city, so it was different. You could meet someone and decide that you wanted to get married to the person. It wasn't arranged, you know. Then for profession in what to study, um, to an extent, you had some input on what you wanted to study, but I think ultimately your parents guided you with that decision. They wouldn't tell you that this is what you have to study, but if they didn't like what you were going to study, they will guide you and direct you on what you have to study. So there wasn't so much of a freedom in that sense. Yes.
All right. Finally, could you tell us how do you think life growing up as a girl in Nigeria differs from other countries? And has life changed much for girls growing up in Nigeria in the 80s compared to recent years?
Okay. As the girl in Nigeria, the difference I think between growing up as a girl in Nigeria and growing up in another country is there seems to be more freedom. Girls have seem to have more freedom here in the Western world. You know, they are free to make their own choices, and they are free to dress as they choose, and they are free to go where they would like. They can go to a pub, they can go to a restaurant. Um, you know, they are able to make decisions on what to study. Their parents don't harass them or, maybe ask them, you know, direct their life. So there is more freedom. And In Nigeria at the moment, life has changed for girls compared to when I grew up, because I notice girls have more freedom. They tend to now wear more trousers than we used to. You know, um, they're more adorned, maybe makeup, and you know, they seem to have more freedom as well, maybe choosing what they want to study. Um, even like, of course, they still make them do girls do more housework, but there seems to be more freedom for girls compared to when I grew up in the 80s. And even in the rural areas, girls are able to choose who they want to marry, without parents getting involved. So it's a lot is changing now. So thank you.
All right. Thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Ava Bala, and today I'm going to be interviewing my granny, Cecily O'Hara, on the changing role of women in Irish history. So, for my first question, I'd love for you to tell me about your life and what your life was like growing up and some key changes that you've noticed personally.
Hello, Eva. Well, growing up for me was on a small farm, just 30 acres outside Ballinrobe in County Mayo. I was the second youngest of 13 children. We had plenty to play with, as you can imagine, and the older siblings were always there to help us get dressed and feed us. My father was a very hard-working man with the tillage, the hay, the corn, and of course working in the bog where we were expected to help out. We also had the geese and the ducks whom my mum used to feed when Dad was gone away on the farm. We always had plenty of organic vegetables the whole year round. Mother was so busy baking and cooking on an open fire for most of her life. When we were big enough, and that would be only at age 8 and 9, we would help out to rake the hay and the corn and bring tea to the bog to my dad after we came home from school. We walked to school through the fields, and we had such great fun with all the neighbouring children. Nobody was different in those days. Nobody had any more than us. So we would run around the fields, and indeed my mum would come sometimes to look for us. The one big change and the great excitement in the house was when my mother got her first washing machine, and after that she got a gas cooker and a fridge. And if she got the lotto, it wouldn't have meant more than her.
I can imagine. And after growing up, how was getting a job and what happened through that process, and has it changed, do you think?
Well, Eva, I wanted to be a nurse always, but in fifth year in school, we all sat an entrance exam for the civil service. And the day I finished my leaving cert in 1970, I came home to give a letter to say that I was called to the civil service. So I head off a few days later up to Dublin, and started work there. And a few months afterwards, I had applied for nursing in the Richmond Hospital, which I got after sitting an interview. And you also needed just one science subject and quite a decent leaving cert. But it's so different nowadays, and it's so pressurized with the point system. And of course, for everybody in those days, it wasn't as easy. I had 6 brothers, and they all had to immigrate, both to New York and London. And 2 of my older sisters went to London, but both of them came back and married at home. My brothers never came back to Ireland, because for them in those days, they didn't have full education, and that was their option. And they just worked on the local farms to help out the men who had a few bob, because my father wouldn't have had really any money to give to them. It was my experience quite easy. It's what I wanted, and I got it, and I loved it, and I spent 32 years at it. And I hope things might change to help the students of today to try and get into nursing.
Yes, I hope so too. It sounds like a beautiful profession. And going back to that, saying that you grew up from a small town in Mayo and coming to Dublin, do you feel like that changed your culture, and what does your culture mean to you?
What culture really means to me, Eva, is really my beliefs, my way of life, my practices, my moral upbringing, really, and moral standards that I have and I still hold deeply. I have a great sense of belonging as well. And believe it or not, after 50 years in Dublin, I will still say that I'm going back home to Mayo. and I will always keep that. Of course, coming to Dublin was a huge culture change, or indeed a shock. It was probably the proper way of putting it. But you had no choices in those days. If you wanted to further your education, you had to get to some city, and I chose Dublin. And it was quite easy enough for me because I had two sisters here, so I was able to come up to them. So many different experiences when you got from the small country farm up to the city as well, such as the different nationalities, and there weren't a lot of them there in 1970, but still it was a big change for me. The different foods, the beliefs that the other people have, you had to respect all of those. But I held on dearly to my beliefs and my religion and the mass going, as indeed most of my colleagues did in those times as well.
And coming from such a large family of 13, I believe, what changes have you noticed in family structure through different generations?
Well, the main difference really is the smaller families. In my time of growing up, it was absolutely the norm to have 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe up to 16 children in households. But now it's seldom you would see more than 3 or 4. And I suppose the more norm, to be honest with you, is 2 children. There was no such thing in younger days, of course, as you probably know of, as such a thing as contraception. And indeed, when it did come in to being, and if it was available, it was a sin to use it because we were governed very much by the Catholic Church. And indeed, I'm very well aware of some chemists who were asked by ladies, even in my generation, and the chemist told them to go out the door and not to come back into it again for anything at all. So there's definitely huge changes, and probably huge changes for the better, although I'm very, very proud to be one of these 13 wonderful siblings that were in our house.
Yeah, no, it's crazy, especially because now contraception is such a promoted thing. It's really interesting to think about how it has changed, and the different structures of all sorts of, I suppose, generations. And then just my final question, are there any events or times where you noticed a large shift in the role of women in Irish society?
Yes, indeed. I was quite small when I remember the first Bangor, which is now can't be called Bangor anymore, going in. That was in 1959. They all just have to be called Gardaí. And the first female cadets who entered as well in the Defence Forces in 1980 took over the news of the world at that stage. And of course, having all the ladies entering politics nowadays is wonderful as well. Looking back in our history of my very young days with President De Valera and all the men around him, but there were no ladies around at all in those days, and indeed closer than that as well. And our first president, Mary Robinson, in 1990, and followed on by the next president was Mary McAleese in 1997. So that was huge changes, and bula bus to the women of Ireland.
I can imagine, and it must have been so empowering for young women all around Ireland during those times.
Absolutely, it really was. It really was.
Well,
Winona Heron.
yes, I believe. I'd love to thank you for your time and thank you for the interview, and I'm really looking forward to sharing what I've learned.
Thank you very much indeed for asking me. Bye bye now.
Bye, thank you.